you.
Hi,
Thanks.
yeah, how are you?
Hi, Willie. Good to see you.
So, shall I kick off, Moin, and open the panorama for today, so to speak?
Yes, please do, Willie. I think if I may just say, I think if you can kick off with your fantastic book, The White Moguls, and the story, that'll be brilliant. And then we take it from there, and I can talk about Mir Jafar Ali Khan's love story as well. But please start.
We
It's
both,
all.
sure. So, both Moin and I have written um, books that involve interracial love stories, and very significantly, they're 1 century apart. Mine is set it begins in sort of 1798 in Hyderabad at the peak of East India Company influence, just when Marquis Wellesley has taken control and is about to push for paramount power across India and to get rid of the Marathas and Tipu, who are his great enemies. And Moin, what date does your love affair start?
1854.
1854. So it's 50 years apart. But what's I think important is that the incredible difference between the two worlds. When White Moguls opens, the East India Company, although it's about to seize power under Wellesley and Tipu and the Marathas, are defeated within 10 years. When the book opens, the East India Company is only one among many powers in India. And no one at that point could look forward and tell what was going to happen. We know, obviously, in retrospect, that Wellesley does defeat these other powers in India. And the company goes on to seize control of most of India south of the Himalayas. And then, of course, we have the whole period, 90 years that follows of the British Raj, Victoria, and all the Kipling, Curzon, and all the rest of it. But obviously, no one at the time knew that. And the world that we are conditioned to think of when we think of the British in India, in other words, the world of pith helmets and the Simla Mole and clubs and civil lines and all that whole baggage of material that comes with British Raj. None of that was in place. And instead, what you have in the late 18th century is the very different world of the East India Company. Now, it's not to say that the British were any better behaved at this period. In fact, the East India Company, as I've tried to show in the Anarchy, more recent than White Moguls, was incredibly extractive. And its main reason for existence was to make a profit for its shareholders at the expense of India. But it was also much more than the Raj, which was imposed from the top. The East India Company was, to an odd extent, deeply collaborative. It conquered India with Indian troops. 90% of the East India Company's army was locally sourced largely from Awadh and Bihar. And the money to pay for those troops came in part from Indian bankers and in part from bonds East India Company bonds bought by people in Bengal. And so the world which was to come with these very strict racial divides was not in place in the East India Company. And indeed, in the 1780s, 1 in 3 British men in India was leaving everything in his will to either an Indian woman or an Anglo-Indian child or multiple children.
That's just astonishing, Willie. 1 in every 3. That is astonishing.
In the 1780s. And we know the details of this.
Sorry, in the 1780s?
In the 1780s is the peak of this. And we know the details about this because there was a law the East India Company made very early on, because it had so many descendants of its employees who died in India squabbling over inheritance and lawsuits and so on, that they made a rule that a copy of a will should be sent back to London and kept in the East India Company headquarters. and therefore all legal disputes could be sorted out. There would be no one left intestate. And these wills, as well as giving details of how much everyone owned and possessed and what they had, and details of for example, spittoons and pajamas and bidri wear and all sorts of Indian items that one wouldn't have expected perhaps in an Englishman's wardrobe and so on. We also know the details of their sex lives in great details because they had to write who was going to get their stuff, and they often get, and it varies. Some of these guys are writing very clinically. I leave Betsy, the carriage and the slaves, for example, might be one entry. Others are very emotional. I leave Terenisa, my beloved, or Miranisa, or whatever the particular name would have been. I leave everything which I have gathered. She's been with me from the beginning. And you get these often quite emotional wills too.
Can I just ask something here, Willie?
Yeah.
So let's say the East India Company official has a will. He leaves it to his Indian lady. Who honors the will? Is it honored by the East India Company or the Mughal courts, or who honors that will that the Englishman leaves behind?
Well, as with today, there are you appoint executors in the wills. I know this, and I can remember. This was 20 years ago. I wrote this book, but I remember it in great detail because I went through these wills with the help of my mother-in-law. We went. We went to the office. It took about 2 months. They're in huge, big leather-bound volumes, each the size and heft of a crate of wine. And these poor India Office librarians would bring these volumes, stagger them over to a table, and it would often take a couple of weeks to go through them and process even one volume. But from that, you can get a very accurate statistical idea of who is leaving what to whom, and it's to say an image quite different to the image of the British in their civil lines or the British in their cantonments, keeping themselves apart, and the jewel in the crown or the Kipling version of it.
Sure.
And so, as I said, I don't want in any way to give the impression that these company men were NGO workers toiling for the good of India. The exact opposite is true. They were out to exploit and to ravage, but they did so
enrich themselves emotionally as well as financially.
Yes, and they're closely working with Indian merchants, Indian money lenders. They have Indian girlfriends, they have Indian friends, and it's a world very surprising and very different to the stereotype that emerges. But what you also see in the wills is that this incredible degree of interracial mixing disappears, and it disappears fast and steadily. So we tabulated it, and it's, as I say, about 1 in 3 wills in the 1780s. It's down to about 1 in 4 wills that you find an Indian wife or girlfriend mentioned by the 1790s. 1 in 5 by 1810. Pretty rare, maybe 1 in 6 by the 1830s, and it's pretty well over by 1840, 1850.
Yes.
So what's fascinating is you can actually see statistically, year by year, 2 peoples who had lived with incredible intimacy and with an apparent lack of racial color consciousness, turning into, in a sense, the stereotype that we all know of the British and India, keeping apart, keeping separate, racial superiority, racism, and the full Victorian package. And that's in place by 1840. And in a sense, that's what helps provoke the Great Uprising of 1857, called in Britain still the Indian Mutiny, and in India the First War of Independence. And it is partly that, in a sense, these 2 peoples who have been collaborating to try and make money out of post-Mughal India in the company. That is the Marwari merchants in collaboration with bankers, with the and the company working out of this sort of, Calcutta at that stage as a sort of Dubai or Singapore tax-free zone where these guys can operate out of. So you move from that world where you've got businessmen mixing with Indians, and in the army, East India Company captains who are fluent in Hindustani and Persian, and if they're in the South, Tamil or Kannada, whatever the languages are, and mixing very intimately with their sepoys, who are their only troops, because there are no white troops, or very, very few white troops.
Yeah.
You move from that to the more familiar picture of imported white troops coming in larger numbers by the 1840s and 50s, and much greater distance. And it is partly that distance which helps provoke the uprising, which of course starts among the sepoys themselves. It starts with East India Company employees. And anyway, that is the background against which the main love affair in White Moguls is played out.
I was waiting for that, really.
It's just as the thing is beginning to turn. As I said, in the 1780s, you have 1 in 3 British men recording publicly in a will that his parents will get to see that he's cohabiting with an Indian woman. In other words, you can extrapolate upwards from that. That there's far more cohabitation going on. Just like kids at university won't necessarily tell their parents about casual flings or something. So East India Company servants sitting in India, won't necessarily admit to parents back in Shropshire or the Highlands of Scotland that they've got an Indian girlfriend and a whole family.
Yes.
But by the time that the romance from White Moguls opens in 1798, it's beginning to turn. It's now gone down from 1 in 3 British men emotionally involved or sexually involved with an Indian woman to 1 in 5.
Right.
And very soon it'll go down to 1 in 6 and disappear completely by 1830. So that's the crucial background. And the story takes place in Hyderabad, which is a powerful, independent post-Mughal state. The people there call themselves still the Mughals. They regard themselves as much Mughal servants as the people in Delhi. But since the time of Nizam al-Mulk, they're under the rule of a dynasty of the Nizam. First Nizam al-Mulk, and then by the time that my book opens in 1798, there's Nizam Ali Khan, who is one of Nizam al-Mulk's younger sons. And it's very much a frontier town. The Nizam, at the beginning of this book, signs a treaty with the East India Company through the agency of this young man, James Achilles Kirkpatrick, who's the hero of the book. And what's fascinating about Kirkpatrick is that because his love affair gets tangled up with the politics of the signing of this treaty, and because his enemies say that he's being too influenced by the Nizam and the Nizam's court, you actually get 2 full-scale two full-scale private inquiries into James Kirkpatrick's affair with Karanisa.
And if I may just ask here, Willie, the enemies of James Kirkpatrick are the East India Company officials who are not for the romance between him and Karanisa. Am I right?
They believe, actually rightly, that he has been compromised. They're rather like a sort of a Russian KGB honey trap with some gorgeous Svetlana sent to seduce the British ambassador and film some sort of Trump-like video of golden showers in the British Embassy building or whatever it is. The theory got around that Kirkpatrick had got involved with a princess, got her pregnant, and that this was influencing his negotiation with the Nizam. This turned out to be true.
But tell us a little more about Karanisa, Willie, if I may just understand this lady a little bit more.
So Karanisa is only 16 when the story opens, so that's the normal time for marriage. That, oddly enough, was one thing that wasn't scandalous at the time, though to us it appears a scandalously young age to get involved with anyone. she is of Persian extraction. Her grandfather had come to Hyderabad from Western Iran. And this was a period when highly educated Persian intellectuals were very welcome in these Islamicized post-Mughal courts. They were considered to be, extremely literate. They knew the Persian classics, and they were often given preference in employment and senior positions to either local Muslims or local Hindus. And her family had risen up, and at the time of the romance, her cousin Mir Alam is one of the two rivals, sort of viziers at the court, and the whole thing gets caught up in a honey trap laid on by her cousin's rival, a man called the Ristuja. Anyway, it's an extremely complicated plot.
What an intriguing plot!
That's rather like a le Carre plot. I mean, I got so deeply into it when I was writing it, and trying to reduce the story to greater simplicity subsequently when I've been doing documentaries on this and so on. It's only then that I realized, in a sense, quite how complicated the actual plot is. At the time I wrote the book, I was so into every detail, I barely noticed the complexity of it.
So but the love between the two of them is absolutely genuine.
So love is genuine. There is some suggestion that Karenisa's family not only didn't resist this love affair, but also slightly threw her at Kirkpatrick.
Oh, very interesting.
Believing that it would be an advantageous match. Whether they were actually threatened by by Aristuja, who was the rival to their cousin, and actually sort of forced into this relationship is a question that the inquiry is trying to answer. So we get a series of minor officials at the Residency being invited to Madras to give evidence in secret to try and find out. And they ask very personal and detailed questions. How did the girl get into Kirkpatrick's bed? Who initiated it? Was there any suggestion of an abortion? I mean, really detailed and contemporary questions of a sort one doesn't normally come across in historical sources are asked in this, and it's because it's in secret. That's in a sense these questions.
Sorry, if I might just ask a question here. So, if the indication was that Khairunisa's family encouraged this romance, was there a sense of a deep understanding that the East India Company or the British were in super ascendancy mode, and this could be a terrific move to gain, terrific political traction in these times?
Exactly right. And the question was it more than that? Was it just so the question basically being asked was it a romance? Was it an ambitious family trying to get advantage by allying themselves with the British? Or was the whole thing an entire setup to trap James Kirkpatrick?
Fascinating.
That's what the inquiry is setting out to try and find out, because no one knows.
Yeah.
But what happens is that in the end, because Kirkpatrick is able to get such intimate access and such detailed information and make such deep links with the local community, he pulls off this alliance with the Hyderabad court that is of huge assistance to the East India Company. It basically gives them the base to take out first Tipu, then the Marathas. But it also protects Hyderabad, which is the weakest and most vulnerable of the states in the south. At any moment, Tipu or the Marathas could have extinguished it. Instead, the alliance with the company makes it the largest of the princely states, and it survived right up until 1948, 1 year after independence, when it's finally invaded in the police action by the Republic of India. Nehru sends the troops in because Nizam in 1948 can't make up his mind between India and Pakistan, so Nehru makes it up for him. And the fact that Hyderabad which, is not only modern Telangana, but quite a lot of Andhra, Karnataka, and even a bit of Bombay state. This enormous state, which has the same GDP in 1948 as Belgium. It's a massive, rich country, and the Nizam is the premier nobleman. So today we often think of, Rajasthan and the Jodhpur and Udaipur as the great princely states, but in 1947 and before that,
yes.
it was Hyderabad. Hyderabad was the number one.
Yeah.
And that alliance is secured by Kirkpatrick against the background of this romance. And in the aftermath of signing this treaty, the Nizam is so pleased with Kirkpatrick that he offers to build him a residency building. And he does. And the residency, which survives, is exactly the same design as the modern White House in Washington. Same date, same design. It's a carbon copy. In fact, slightly precedes the White House. And
we have Trump there now, Willie, enjoying the looks of that residency.
And it's just been restored. We have managed to raise £1 million and get it restored with a joint venture with the World Monuments Fund and various other generous donors. Anyway, so alongside the very English-looking Palladian residency, as I say, a kind of carbon copy of the White House, Kirkpatrick builds a second palace in the garden, using some pre-existing Mughal garden ruins as Kerunisa's Rang Mahal. And it's a painted palace full of fountains and parterres and arches. And he leads this double life. By day, he's the British resident in a company red coat in the Palladian building. By night, he's in kurta pajamas beside the fountains, smoking hookahs and getting up to who knows what with Kerunisa.
Speaking fluent Persian and Urdu?
He speaks totally. He's born in India, and he speaks not only fluent Persian and Urdu, but also several South Indian languages.
Fabulous.
Possibly, he was born in Madras, and so possibly spoke Tamil through an ayah as his first language. So it's a fabulous insight into a wider story, because not only do we have these detailed inquiries into their sex life, when you get as close as you possibly can to just prying your nose as a historian into the bedroom. But you also have every single week Kirkpatrick writes to his half brother, who is Lord Wellesley's military secretary and who's caught up in all the scandals which are going on because of this relationship. And so we have 4, 5, 6 pages of letter every week, like a diary from Kirkpatrick. And that was the basis. That's why the book is quite how fat this book is. It's this is White Mogul, and it's no slim volume. Anyway, so I'm taking up more than my fair share of the time here. But just to finish off with White Moguls, so the romance survives. 2 children are born, and they live happily in these 2 palaces side by side. And in 1803, Kirkpatrick decides he wants to send the children, who are now 5 and 6, to Britain, because he is aware that the changing environment is becoming openly racist to what are then known as half-caste children. And he wants them to be able to operate in both worlds. Already, the children they're brought up as Shia Persian-speaking Hyderabadi nobles. He wants them to be able to cope in England too. So he plans to send them off to his brother, who's just retired in Exeter. And in the course of taking them to Madras, he catches some sort of fever, dies in Calcutta, away from Kerunisa. Kerunisa comes all the way north on her own, on her elephant, and comes to mourn by his grave in Park Street Cemetery in Calcutta.
Gosh, what an end!
And then, but it isn't quite then, because she's then seduced by his assistant several years later, and then dumped, and she dies miserable and heartbroken, and is allowed back in the Rang Mahal to die at the end of the story.
Tragic.
And at the very end, I found a series of letters about her death, which I didn't know about right until the kind of 11th hour of writing the book. After 5 years of research, I still didn't know the final details of what happened to her. And they turned up in the Scottish National Archives in Edinburgh, a series of letters from a girlfriend of the terrible seducer, Henry Russell, which tell the final tragic details of the story. Anyway, Moin, I got overexcited here, getting back into the story. So over to you. So your story is a very different period and in a very different setting.
Well, yes, thank you, Willie. That's absolutely riveting. And I don't know how I'm going to match that, but nevertheless, I'll have a crack. The story that I wrote about is the story of Mir Jafar Ali Khan, who is the custodian of the royal house of Surat and is also the ruling prince of a tiny principality in Kathiawar, Saurashtra. Now, the word Saurashtra, as we literally know, means 100 states, Saurashtra. And it was the most densely populated part of princely India because it was dotted with more than 100 princely estates in Gujarat. Some of them had been recognized by the East India Company as independent ruling principalities as the Mughal Empire began to collapse. Some of them hadn't. But he had this particular princely state of his called Kamardia. And he was also the custodian of the royal house of Surat because he had married the only surviving princess of Surat. And the last Nawab had appointed him his successor. Nevertheless, just to give you a snapshot background, the East India Company is up to its tricks. It strips the family of its estates, and he eventually finds himself in Victorian England, fighting his case in the House of Commons. His first trip to England is a disaster. It's a complete failure. He gets to England in 1844. People in England give him a patient hearing, but the minute they come to know that he's ruffling feathers in the political and social scenario, they pull back. And it's only because of a very charmed and lucky meeting with Victoria and Albert that he gets a little bit of a window. And Victoria helps him by introducing him to her Solicitor General, who's completely moved by the case and decides to take it into the Houses of Parliament to fight on behalf of this Indian prince who's been stripped of his rightful rights. But he doesn't have the money, Willie, to carry on in England. And he has to come back to India. Now, when he comes back to India, for 9 years, he loses himself in rural Gujarat, which is where his paternal principality was, in Kamandia. And for 9 years, he leads the life of a mystic. He basically mortgages his tiny principality to the moneylenders, takes money, and is about to go back to England when his father forces him to get married again because his first wife passes away. And he's completely against this marriage. He doesn't want to marry because from the first marriage, he has 2 daughters. And he tells his father that, listen, my cause is to fight for my daughters' rights, and I'm going to England to fight for them. But the father is so concerned with the paternal succession to this small estate in Gujarat that he forces his son to get married to a very pious lady called Basti Begum, who is the daughter of the Qazi of Ahmedabad. And the Qazi had been appointed by Akbar Shah II.
I love the idea of Basti Begum.
Basti Begum, yeah, exactly. But Basti as in terms of inhabitation rather than Basti. So he marries her. And he's quite upset about the whole thing. But nevertheless, the date for departure to England arrives, and he leaves for England in August 1853. He arrives in England in December 1853 to freezing conditions, makes himself rather comfortable in this house called number 15 Warwick Avenue, settles in. He actually comes with an incredible entourage. There are dhol players who play the dhol in Paddington. There are cooks who stir up a curry for him every night. There's his personal barber. There's a gatekeeper called
No
Dost
wonder he
Muhammad.
didn't take out a bit of a loan before he went on his trip.
Exactly. So he comes with all of this incredible regalia, and central London is completely taken in by by this exotic Indian display of curry and jewels and gowns and all of that. The political side of it is quite acute, because when he presents his case again to Sir Richard Bethell, who is the Solicitor General to Victoria, there's no doubting in his mind that it has to go into the Houses of Parliament as a bill called the Nawab of Surat Treaty Bill. And that bill gets tabled much later in 1856, but the lead up between 1854 and 1856 is very, very, it's quite detailed in terms of paperwork. Because it has to go through, the special judicial committee that's been appointed by the Parliament and all of that. Nevertheless, while all of this study is going on by his lawyers, Sir Fitzroy Kelly, who's another member of Parliament who's looking after his interest, invites him to the Astley Amphitheatre, which is this incredible place in London where, it's almost like a circus, where they have these fascinating, depictions of the defeat of Napoleon, playing out with booming cannons and tremendous horses circulating around the area. And he's invited for the celebration of the victory at Waterloo. And he enters, dressed in his jewels and his gowns, and in the front row of this particular ode that is being sung, to the fallen martyrs of Waterloo, is this incredible lady called Mary Jane Flood, singing this tremendous ode to the fallen martyrs of Waterloo. Mary Jane Flood is stunningly good looking, at least as far as, when one reads the letters that he writes about her, describing her blonde hair.
Have you got photographs of her?
Sorry?
Have you got photographs of her or pictures?
Willie, quite like the end of your research, we looked everywhere for pictures. We have one sketch of her, but we don't have a picture of her. And we have these incredible letters, which I based my research on.
Do we have a sketch of Busty Begum?
Sorry?
Do we have a sketch of Busty Begum?
We don't have a sketch of Busty Begum, unfortunately. But it would be something where he rocks his life between Busty Begum and Mary Jane Flood. But nevertheless, so almost instantly he's quite smitten by Mary Jane Flood, and as the ode has come to an end, he makes his way and strikes up a conversation with her in terms of, through his entrepreneurs. And she's quite charmed by him. She comes from a very small little town called Burnley, which is in Lancashire. So she's
a northern lass.
Yeah, exactly. So she's not from a very, she's not from an aristocratic background. She actually was an orphan. She had lost her parents at a very young age, and she came to London to pursue her career in acting. She actually fails miserably at the Globe. She never makes it. She has an aspiration to be acting at the Globe.
This is a period of English history when actresses are considered slightly morally dubious.
Precisely.
Rather like tawaifs in Indian culture, in Mughal culture. Precisely,
absolutely right, Willie. And she tries to make it into the theatre circle in Britain, but she fails miserably. It probably seems that she's not very talented, but she's apparently got a very good voice, and she's a good singer. And that's how she gets this particular piece to sing, at the ode of the fallen martyrs of Waterloo. Nevertheless, what comes out of the letters is that what Mir Jafar Ali Khan is really charmed by is this incredibly self-made woman. He's not used to self-made women, and here he finds this lady who's had a very tough childhood, being an orphan, and who's come out there and who's made it not made it in London, but she's trying desperately to make it in London to earn her own living. And he finds that incredibly charming. And this romance starts blossoming, There are times when the couple is spotted in Little Venice, taking little boat rides, and it also starts getting written about in newspapers. Now, all of this is happening, and as you rightly pointed out, Willie, in one of our earlier conversations, this is probably the fag end, or the last of an acceptance, so to speak, of cross-pollinated romances, which started off in the late 18th century and then really took off in the early 1800s. But Mir Jafar Khan and Mary Jane Flood are probably, as you rightly pointed out in the last conversation, they're the last of the Mohicans, if you wish. And what I found really fascinating is that as this romance picks up, he is such an incredibly South Asian man that he's very superstitious, because as the romance is picking up, he's also gaining traction in the Houses of Commons. And in his writings, he absolutely, gives all credit, and all of this good fortune and this luck is because of her. He says, that because of her coming into my life, my fortunes are turning. And and because of her, I'm seeing a new horizon and all of that. Nevertheless, it's a dramatic parliamentary session in 1856, and he goes on to become the only Indo vote in the House of Commons, where he wins 218 MP ayes to noes, and his bill is passed. And now the question is, will he actually take her back to India? Because he promises to take her back to India. And she's
up for it, isn't she?
Sorry?
She's up for it. She's got her eyes on a nice Gujarati
lifestyle and a life, living a life in a Gujarat Nawab's palace. But at the same time, she's genuine. What I gathered from the letters that I read, she's quite genuinely in love with him. Keeps harking back to her lost, the fact that she doesn't have parents. Nevertheless, he does keep his word, and he does bring her back to India, and back first to Surat, where his daughters are, and where his second wife is. It's a very, very interesting meeting, because Basti Begum is behind a Chilman, and I bet she waiting for a husband, and he actually takes Mary Jane Flood across to her and introduces Mary Flood to his wife, and Basti Begum puts out a jeweled wrist as an acceptance of friendship, and she's taken into the palace, and the romance apparently continues to thrive. The tragedy lies, and I'm going to bring this to a very quick close so that we can go back to questions. The tragedy lies in the fact that Mir Jafar Ali Khan gets poisoned by the Makranis. Yes, the Makranis were these incredible tribal warriors who had flooded into Kathiawar, and Jafar Ali Khan had fought them in a battle, fighting on behalf of the Maharaja of Baroda, and had defeated them in a tribal war in 1817. And they take revenge by poisoning him, and he actually dies in her arms. And she's desperately trying to get water for him as he's dying. But before he dies, he had taken her to Kamadea, which was this rural principality of his. And she had charmed the local villagers. She had charmed the local children. She had even, set up a little school to teach them English. And when he dies, it is the local villagers of Kamadea who actually come to take her back to that village. Because when their prince dies, leaving behind a son from Basti, the villagers of Kamadea are the ones who say, listen, we will support you to stay back in Kamadea and live in the Bargad over there. It's quite tragic, because Basti actually turns on Mary Jane Flood. And although Mir Jafar... Sorry?
I bet she does.
Yes. And because she's the mother of the sun and the air. And she has that trump
And
cast
she
to play
regards
against.
Mary Jane as
And she says that although
she regards Mary Jane as this sort of white nawab snatcher.
no stature, and so she actually threatens, and she says that if you want your monthly allowance, that
Um, people were asking what happened to the children of Kirkpatrick and Kerenisa, and it's a very tragic story. The two kids are sent off to England, and they arrive, and they're told by their horrible uncle that they can't correspond with their mother. So Kerenisa, who's widowed in Calcutta, aged just 21, is no longer allowed to speak or keep in contact with her children. And the children are baptized on arrival, having been Shia Muslims. They are taken to a church and immediately doused in holy water and turned, without any reference to their own wishes, into Christians. And they grow up as good church-going English Anglicans, cut off from their Muslim and cut off from their Indian links.
so Sir T.C. Hope, who's the guardian of the son of the young boy, eventually sends him to England for further education. And oddly enough, during his stay in England, the curious boy looks for Mary Jane Flood, and he finds her. And every Sunday he would go to Burnley and visit Mary Jane Flood, whom he eventually landed up giving the same amount of respect as he did his own mother. And she would cook a chicken roast and all of that for him. And he actually looked after her as long as he could while he was in England. And when he returned to India, he would actually send her monthly allowance right till the time that she died. And so it's a terrific story, and I found it tremendously enriching when I researched and wrote it.
Oh, what a moving story! So there's a got a bittersweet ending to my story too. So when we froze, I was in the middle of telling what happened to the children.
Yes.
And just to recap, the children are sent back to London. On arrival, virtually the day they arrive back, their uncle, without any permission from either parent, baptizes them. It's up to then they've been Shia Muslim. And they're given a baptism, and they're brought up as Christians. And they're forbidden from communicating with their mother, Kerenisa, who's still alive and well and young, still only 21 years old, and widowed at this incredibly young age. And they hear nothing more from her. And the boy has a terrible accident in his young teens. He falls into a vat of boiling water somehow and dies young. But the daughter, who had been known as Saab Begum, and had been this great beauty as a child, grew into an even more beautiful adult, Kitty Kirkpatrick, after her baptism.
Yeah.
And she leads a conventional life. She marries a colonel in the Hussars. She's an evangelical Christian. They live in Torquay. It really couldn't be more suburban. It's the same town that Fawlty Towers is set in, and John Cleese hotel land. And then one day, an incredible accident takes place. Before the children are taken to England, they have their portrait painted by the great artist Chinnery in Madras. And somehow, after the death of James Kirkpatrick, his assistant, who's the one who seduced Kerenisa, Henry Russell, the terrible seducer Henry Russell, gets his hands on the picture and ships it back to England with him. He has no right to this. He's not related to this family in any way, but because Chinnery is a celebrated artist, he hangs on to it. It's very valuable. And he hangs it on his stairs. And by pure twist of fate, and if ever there is a movie of White Mughals, as we hope there will be, this is clearly the opening scene where the whole thing begins. Kitty, aged 35 or something, a beautiful young married woman, with one child of her own, is going to stay with some friends. They plan to have a picnic, and by a change of plan, the picnic is rained off, and they take shelter in this house called Swallowfield, which one of her party knows the wife. They walk in, and there in front of them, hanging from the stairs, is the picture of Kitty in Hyderabad as a 7-year-old. And she's now 25. She can't believe it. What is this picture of her? She instantly recognized it, although it's 30 years she's seen it. And she starts to make inquiries. Henry Russell isn't at home, so she doesn't meet Henry Russell, and she leaves and goes and begins to research. And she gets in touch with one of the assistants at the Hyderabad residency, who tell her discreetly what happened. That Henry Russell had seduced her mother, and that her mother had died and was no longer alive. But her granny, who was the one who was originally accused of setting up the whole romance, and who in the inquiry is trying to find out whether the granny had actually thrown Kitty whether the granny had thrown Heronisa into James Kirkpatrick's arms.
Right.
Granny is still alive in a harem in Hyderabad. And through the residency, the new resident, Kitty writes to her grandmother, using the resident as a translator. So these two women who haven't seen each other for 30 years begin a correspondence. One is an evangelical Christian now living in Torquay. Another is a Shia Muslim living in a harem in Hyderabad, in a palace. And yet, and I'll just read, just to finish, the letter that Kitty writes after a 30-year gap. This is her writing to her grandma. I often think of you and remember you and my dear mother. I often dream that I am with you in India and that I see you both in the room you used to sit in. No day of my life has ever passed without my thinking of my dear mother. I can remember the veranda and the place where the tailors worked, and the place on the housetop where my mother used to let me sit down and side. When I dream of my mother, I am in such joy to have found her again that I awake, or else am pained that I cannot understand, that she cannot understand the English I now speak. I can well recollect her cries when we left her, and I can now see the place where she sat when we parted, and her tearing her long hair. What worlds I would give to possess one lock of that beautiful and much-loved hair. How dreadful to think that so many, many years have passed, when it would have done my heart such good to think that you loved me. And when I longed to write to you and tell you these feelings I was never able to express, a letter which I'm sure would have been detained by my uncle. And now, how wonderful it is, after 35 years, that I'm able for the first time to hear that you think of me and love me, and have perhaps wondered why I did not write to you. And you have thought me cold and insensible to such near, dear ties. I thank God that he has opened a way for making the feelings of my heart known to you. Will this letter reach you? And will you care for the letter of your grandchild? My own heart tells me you will. May God bless you, my own dear grandmother.
Fabulous.
So
Gosh, fabulous, Willie. That was absolutely brilliant. Absolutely fantastic. Oh my God, that is just so moving. Fantastic.
And the granny sends back Kerenisa's hair that she's kept, a lock of the hair, for her for 35 years.
Unbelievable.
And they make plans to meet, but then the granny dies and the two are never reunited.
Tragic, absolutely tragic, but how brilliant. I really, and I'll ask you this question as well, but when I was researching the part of the time when Mary Jane Flood and Basti Begum actually strike this relationship where there is a sense of cordiality. You know, my space is mine, yours is yours. You are my husband's girlfriend, but I'm the wife. And although I'm descended from the sun, you know, my heart actually went out to Mary Jane Flood. And I felt I felt the enormous emotion that she must have felt, being an orphan, being brought to India, being loved, being looked after. But the insecurity of it all must have really been enormous. And when I went to Kamadia, which I still do, which is this rural principality of Mir Jafar Ali Khan, and you see the ruins of the Darbargarh, they still echo with this incredibly passionate love that Mir Jafar Ali Khan and Mary Jane had. And they even had this, and she writes in her letters that you and I also share the same initials, MJ. She was Mary Jane, he was Mir Jafar. And she had a coat of arms made out in MJ being locked into MJ. And, she used to walk by the river and pitch tents and recite Persian and Urdu and Gujarati poetry that she had been taught by Mir Jafar Ali Khan. And the villagers, some of them till today remember her blue eyes,
Yeah.
and they talk about the fact that she had taught them, well, their ancestors, she had made an attempt at teaching them English. And invariably, when you write these stories, there is this. I mean, at least I felt, a part of me being lost, in those words, in those chapters, and you leave that in those chapters for the rest of your life. There's a part of you in those chapters. Did you experience the same, Willie?
Yeah, I mean, I got more obsessed with this book than any other I've ever written, and the sensation of coming towards the end of this enormous mountain of letters in the India Office Library, and now in the British Library, and still not knowing what happened to Karenisa, which I only discovered literally about pre-publication, and I had almost despaired ever of finding the end of the story. I know these are very, very moving tales. I mean, I very much hope there will be a movie. We've sold the film rights. Well, originally it went to this company, and as the producer was leaving my garden, having got the signed contract, I said, "What are you doing now?" And he said, "Oh God, some fantasy thing we're shooting in Belfast with dragons." And this, of course, was Game of Thrones, which. Should we say proved rather a distraction for him over the last few years? But anyway, there is a script, and Rafe Fiennes is due to direct it, and Rafe visited the Hyderabad residency this Christmas. So it may still happen, but it's been so long now that it hasn't happened that I'd be more surprised.
And hopefully, Willie, when Leonie and I restore the Darbargarh in Kamadia, we would love to invite you. Because it was the place where this romance thrived. It was away from Surat. It was in the interiors of Gujarat, and he could live his life there with Mary Jane Flood, away from all the intrigues of a big city. And even when I go there and I see the ruins of that place, it's haunting.
I'm coming.
It's
We're out of luck now.
Every stone in that ruin speaks of this lost love, and we've started now planting bougainvillea there. We've started planting neem trees there, and hopefully, if Mary Jane and Mir Jafar Ali Khan's spirit allows us, we'll even restore it and name it after them. But you do leave a part of yourself with this book. The one thing, though, I do want to just very, very quickly talk about the son, Mir Zulfiqar Ali, when he goes to England, and he makes an acquaintance with his father's girlfriend, and he starts looking after her. He does mention in one of his diary, he says, "I was always under the impression that the English kept their emotions under wraps. They never wore it on their sleeve. But when I engage with this lady, whom I consider as good as my mother, she is more emotional than even the Indians in the way she looks after me. Every Sunday, she waits for me to arrive, and she makes." He even writes, she makes the roast well done because she knows Indians don't like bloody meat.
A lovely story.
Just sweet tales like that. Should we take some questions, Willie?
I've all set here. Everyone wants to know the name of your book, Mia. There's the question that's coming up here, I think.
Sorry?
The name of your book.
It's Surat Fall of a Port, Rise of a Prince. And in Britain, it's published under a new title by my British publishers. And in Britain, it's called The Prince Who Beat the Empire.
Good title. Good title.
Thank
And my
you.
one is called just simply White Moguls. And this is Karenisa. And we hope to coming to a screen near you. Thank you all for sitting through all this. Here's our third. I'm not sure whether we're going to be doing any more. We'll see. But it's been great fun, Moin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Willie, and all the very best. And let's stay in touch.
Keep safe. Keep away from Corona.
Yeah, you too. Thank you, viewers. Thank you, Roli. Thanks, Willie.
Bye bye. Thank you, Roli. Yes, thank you for giving us the program. Thank you.